Hey guys, my name is Haley, and today we're going to be filming my January wrap up, which is a little bit late because if you saw all of my technical difficulties about my favorite books of 2024, we're a little behind already this year, so we're doing some catch up. But yes, I read 14 books in the month of January. I will give the disclaimer, so much of it was nonfiction, which is not normal for me, but seems to be the norm going forward because I've been picking up a lot of nonfiction books while thrifting and such, especially for the last month or two. So you will probably be seeing more of that in the coming months, just as a heads up, because I know anybody that's been here for a while is going to be like, since when do you read the nonfiction? Since now. Since the current regime who's trying to get rid of history. Okay, moving on. So the first book I read in 2025 was The Garden of Witches by Salem Sinclair. If you saw my reading smut books for Halloween video, I'll link that down below. I read a very, very short, like 30-40 page novella by Salem Sinclair and really liked her writing, even though it was literally just a tiny little smut book. And so I was like, okay, I'll look and see if she has anything else I'm interested in. And she had a book about a boarding school for witches, and I was like, sold. It's on KU. I don't think you can buy it physically, which I'm very upset about because I really liked this. I gave it 4.5 stars. This is the story about these girls. They're like twins. Their mom passes away and they end up having to move into this like boarding school that their dad got a job at. They haven't always lived with their dad because their parents were not together anymore, but they have to move into this boarding school because that's where their dad works. And they get enrolled, and there's a lot of prejudice of people being like, you shouldn't be here, but also there is like a poly type romance, MFM, I guess, not so much MMF, a little bit, maybe both, depending on the part of the story. But there is that romance going on, as well as there is a mystery going on in the school about these kids who have gone missing, and there seems to be some sort of creature in the woods that is taking some of the students, and the school seems to be covering it up. So I really enjoyed this. This is like the perfect type of like paranormal romance I really like, and I really wish this was a series because I was very into it. So I'll be watching out for Salem Sinclair in the future, and if there is ever a physical copy of this, I will be purchasing it because I really enjoyed it and I love the cover. Next up, I continued on my David Sodergran journey. You've seen me; I've been reading a lot of his books, but I read Satan's Burnouts Must Die. I will say this has been my least favorite, and I've read four, 4 or 5 of his books, somewhere around there. And one of his books was on my favorite books of the year last year. And this one was, I feel like it didn't have as much plot as his other books do. He does horror, but in like a very specific way, like almost with some humor a lot of the time. This one just felt very much like gore for gore's sake. I don't know if this is one of his earliest books. I have not paid attention to the publication order of the books of his that I've read, but I personally feel like this was his older book. I could be wrong, but I didn't like this one as much, so I gave it 3 stars. I didn't even say what that was about. It is about this biker gang that goes through like small towns in the middle of nowhere and like murders and like attacks women. So it was a weird book. It was far too much real world horror as opposed to a lot of like almost supernatural horror all of his other books have been that I've read at least. Next up, I have a copy of this, but I cannot for the life of me find it because I just reorganized my shelves. And that is At Night I Become a Monster by Yuri Samino. And this is the same author of a manga that I read years ago that I really loved called I Want to Eat Your Pancreas. Probably my favorite manga of all time. I don't read a lot of manga, but I love that one. And this is a light novel, which, if you didn't know, is like the novelization of a lot of mangas. And they tend to be shorter and easier and faster reads. And this was about a boy who turns into a monster at nighttime, like a literal monster, and goes and checks out his school to roam it freely. And he finds out that there's a girl within their class who is very much not of the popular crowd. A lot of people pick on her and nobody's really friends with her. And it's him dealing with the concept of bullying as he is also becoming this monster at nighttime. And they like forge a sort of friendship, but it's him struggling with, does he keep along with this friendship at school and risk being ridiculed alongside this girl that nobody likes. And it dealt a lot with bullying, which in Japan or Asian culture in general, I know Japan has a big issue with bullying, and like a lot of the bigger Asian countries do, but Yeah, it was interesting. It wasn't my favorite. I felt like they could have done more with the concept of him becoming this monster, but I gave this 3 stars. It was an okay read. Next up, I listened to the audiobook of a lot of these nonfictions, so here we go. I listened to How to Stand Up to a Dictator by Maria Ressa. This is a woman who grew up in the Philippines and worked for a lot of the news sites and journalism within the Philippines, and is a dual citizen of both the US and the Philippines, and how a lot of the things in the US influence what goes on in the Philippines. It was a fascinating study, and she does specifically talk a lot about what a lot of us are calling, and I will probably be calling it this going forward because that's what most of the people in my circles call them, of Cult 45. If you need a reference of who that is, look for it on TikTok, it'll pop right up. But it is her trying to explain to people the big difference of how much the American culture in particular influences the rest of the world, but specifically in her experience, the Philippines, and how controlled our media is, because she is a journalist and she fought for a lot of the rights that she has with journalism in the Philippines, where she worked for a long time. She's also very much an activist, and I loved hearing her story. It's also very concerning due to the media climate we are in today here in the US. So there's that. Next up, I listened to the audiobook of Cultish. I've been reading all of the cult books. If you haven't noticed, you'll see a lot more themes of that as I pick them up. This is just a girl who looked into the science and the sociology and everything behind cults and why people join them, and the fact that they are very, very, very common in the US for some reason, and she was unpacking why she thinks that is. I really enjoyed this. If it ever goes to paperback, I'll probably buy it because I don't want to pay for the hardcover because I've been mostly buying used books, so highly recommend if you are interested in cults in the way that I am. And then I went to the library, which, if you don't know, I use my library a lot for, specifically Libby, for audiobooks in particular, but I don't use it a lot for, like, I tend to flip flop between my library and KU for ebooks, but I'm really, unless I'm in the mood to read a bunch of ebooks, I tend to use KU more for those because there's no time limit. My library's time limit is like 21 days, and I always have to keep, like, re-borrowing them, and then I feel like I'm, like, keeping them from other people if I don't read them right away, and I never read them right away. So I go have a love-hate relationship with ebooks for my library. So I decided to go in person to my library for the first time in quite a while, I feel like. Especially for the first time in quite a while, to actually check out books physically, which I rarely do anymore. And I want to be better at doing, because any time you step into the building as well as check things out, it is good for the library to have that exposure. So if you are someone who only uses your Overdrive or Libby or whatever the frick it's called now, take a minute to go step inside your library and browse the shelves, because there are actually several things that are not part of their digital catalog. So I picked up a couple of things that were not. The first of those being Genderqueer. This is a nonfiction memoir graphic novel of the author with their story of figuring out their gender and their sexuality and all of that. And this is, I specifically picked up because I know it is on the banned books list, which again is also going to be a lot of my reading going forward, is reading a lot of the banned books that I have not already read, because I haven't read a lot because they were required reading for me in school, which is wild that they're banning them now when most of these I was forced to read as a child in schools. So that's a whole nother topic. I really enjoyed this. I gave this 5 stars. I think it's an important read, and I think it should be in a lot of school libraries because it does help a lot of kids of that age figure out what is going on. And it's a reference. Although Moms of Liberty doesn't agree with that, but again, that's another topic. Yeah. I'm filming.
Hi, I love you.
I love you too.
Keep it posted.
Goodbye. Next up, I picked up a nonfiction that I had never heard of, and that is Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists. I've already returned a lot of these, so that's why I don't have them physically. By Mickey Kendall and illustrated by A. D'Amico. And this was fascinating. This actually, I am someone who's very bad at journaling and has always been bad at it, but because of the political climate, I've decided to try to journal, and I started the journal with me taking notes from this book because I didn't know it physically, and I wanted to keep some of the information. This is a lot about just women throughout history. It's set up as like a sci-fi thing of these kids like doing a virtual tour of history, and it takes them back to these times as like holograms to witness things. and it is just following women through history, specifically a lot of black women, specifically any woman who was undersung in a certain field because of the patriarchy. And I loved this. I gave this 5 stars. I'm probably going to end up buying it as soon as I can find a used copy of it, and I highly recommend if you've never heard of this, because I had never heard of it either, and it was fantastic. Next up, I picked up Be Gay to Do Comics. I also would love to own a physical version of this because the artwork in this is beautiful. This is a compilation of a bunch of queer authors and queer people and queer artists of mostly like graphic depictions of their queer experience or sharing stories or sharing history of LGBTQIA circle of people. This was compiled by Matt Bors. I loved this. This made me go look up any if I ever like really liked one of the art styles, I would look up the author and see if they had anything else, which has added a lot of other books to my TBR, but I highly recommend this as a way to look for new authors, especially. Hi, from Editing Haley, who completely forgot to talk about a whole book during this wrap up, and it was one of my favorites of the month, so this is what we're getting several hours later. So I forgot to talk about Uncultured by Daniela Mestenek Young. And this is actually written by a TikToker that I have followed for quite a while, at the very least since a little before the election and everything. And she was a former captain in the army, and she also grew up in the Children of God cult, which, if you don't know about that, either read her book or go look at her TikTok, because it was basically a Christian sex cult that mostly she grew up in Brazil as a like corner of the cult, and there were so many issues with the way that she grew up. But this is her telling her story and then how she went from being in a church Christian cult into the cult of the US Army, and she is now a cult expert and breaks down what is a cult, what isn't a cult, what do the cult experts say. And she does all of this on her TikTok channel, but this is her original like memoir book of the first like big chunk of her life, and she's currently writing 2 other books. So I'm obsessed with this. It's such a sad story and so scary to think of, and as somebody who also came out of a Christian cult, I relate to a lot of this, unfortunately. So I do recommend that, and I definitely needed to talk about it. Back to the video. Next up, I listened to the audiobook, but I do own this one physically. It is Ta-Nehisi Coates' We Were 8 Years in Power. This is the story of this author who worked a lot with the Obama administration and the stark difference between the 8 years that Obama was in the presidency and all of the things that were accomplished and the ways we were moving forward, especially with racism and things like that, because of who Obama was as a black presenting man, as well as touching on the topics about how extreme racism is in America because of the president that was in place, all of the things that led to making it possible for him to be in the power that he was, and the stark swing change of how we went from Obama into Cult 45 right afterwards, and all of the things that he tore down that were progressive in a lot of ways. And listen, I am very much not somebody who like idolizes Obama. I do think he was a better president than what we have had the last many years and the people that have been in power, but he obviously had his own issues. So I feel like this, because Ta-Nehisi Coates knew Obama somewhat personally and knew a lot about his administration, is a little bit biased, but I do think hearing his lived experience and in that time period, especially as a black man, is a very important story to be told. And then we have a few more books from the library. I got Why Is Everybody Yelling by Marissa Bina Russo. And this is a graphic novel that I found in a little free library after having already borrowed it from the library. It was like the universe gave it to me to have my own copy. But this is the story of a young immigrant girl who grew up in, I believe it's the 50s. Yes. 1950s New York, and all of the issues that she had in her family. Her mom was the way her mom lived her life was very confusing for her, because her mother was a refugee from World War II and had to bring all of her family here, and also was trying to supplement her life and her lifestyle and children and such in very interesting ways. Like, as a very young child, this girl thought she wanted to be like a nun because she went to a Catholic school, and her mom was like, that's not what I meant for you to do. I meant for you to like kind of like religion, but not like that. And so it was a lot of issues of her interesting relationship with her mother, as well as growing up as an immigrant within the US post-war. Yes, this chronicles a big part of her life. I highly recommend listening or reading her story however you can get your hands on it. And then one of the last library books that I've read so far is Seeing Gender by Iris Gottlieb. I really love this. I also will probably try to get my hands on a used copy of this. And this is literally just breaking down a lot of things about gender that people don't understand or just aren't as talked about. So a very easy compilation. I would almost call this like an encyclopedia of gender studies that is very like art forward. It has a lot of artwork in it. It has a huge glossary that you can go look and everything up. Like if you are someone who wants to learn more about these type of things of like gender and sexuality and sexual orientations, this is a great reference. I really enjoyed it. And I read Waysider. This is one of the few like not contemporary fantasy like fiction books I've been reading for a while, and it did take me a while to read this because I really was trying to read through my library books, and pretty much all of my library books were nonfiction based in some way. So it took me a while to get through this one because it's almost 500 pages, but I did read this from KU, so if you would like to check it out, it is there. And that is Waysider by KJ Sutton. I also low-key took my time with this because I was loving it so much. It's one of my favorite things. It's paranormal mystery, like boarding school shenanigans. And the second book doesn't come out until April, and I made a mistake of reading this too early. This is a story about a girl who one night her and her brother are driving down the road and they see someone on the side of the road who looks like they are going to jump from a bridge. So they get out and try to stop this person, and when our main character goes up to like stop them from jumping, he pulls her down with him and her brother jumps after her, and they both out and we don't know what happens. And so our main character, the girl, ends up in the hospital, and she wakes up and her parents have told her that she survived. She was technically dead for a while. Somebody pulled her out of the water, but her brother has passed away. And she learns very quickly after this, once she starts going home, that she can see the ghost of her brother. And so now she can see ghosts because of her near-death experience. And she ends up going to this academy. She learns, at first she thinks she's crazy because she's only seeing her brother, but then she starts to see another one who's like, oh, can I see multiple? And she end up being invited to this academy, learns that they call these things reverence. They're not necessarily ghosts, but they're very similar, and learns that there are people at this academy. Everybody that is there has also had a death experience of some kind, and they all have different powers. There's different houses for the different powers, which I found all of this fascinating. It was very like almost Harry Potter-esque of everybody has their own house based on your abilities or your virtues or things like that. Is our main character learning how to deal with her powers. There is also a strong romance plot in this, I will say. And I really, really liked our romantic interest. His name is literally Sin. Like, his name is Sinister, which, hilarious. Even though he's a very serious person, so funny. I really love this. I gave this 5 stars. I can't wait for the second book because it was definitely a cliffhanger, and I will be checking out other things by KJ Sutton in the future. And then the last thing I read was the graphic novel of the Black Panther Party. This is just something I've been learning more about as I have been reading more and more BIPOC fiction, and it was something I saw a graphic novel for. I am much faster at reading nonfiction when there is a graphic novel or an audiobook involved, so that's why there's a lot of graphic novels here. And this is about the Black Panther Party, which I have heard bits and pieces of over learning a lot of things, especially through TikTok. I don't even want to talk about the TikTok ban. I think it is a violation of free speech, but again, conversation for another day, maybe another video. Maybe I will get into it because I have many opinions. But I felt this was a pretty good depiction of what the Black Panther Party was. A lot of the good that they did, and also a lot of the issues that they ran into, as well as a lot of the moral failings the leaders of the party had. So it wasn't even a like good or bad depiction. It just kind of gave you the history in graphic novel format, and I felt it was very informative. So if that's something you've been wanting to look into and want an easier way of parsing through the information surrounding it, I do recommend the graphic novel format. Yeah, those are all the things I read in the month of January. We're a couple days into February now. I have not read a single thing, so there's that. But I hope you all enjoyed this. Let me know what your favorite book that you've read so far in the year of 2025 is, because January was 17 years long and we finally escaped it. But yeah, thank you all for watching, and I will see all of you guys next time.